Hey guys, so for this roguelite review, I'm going to be reviewing Slay the Spire, which is probably the best roguelite released in 2019, and it's currently my most played roguelite of all time. So as with all my roguelite reviews, this will be split into various sections, so feel free to skip around to whatever part you actually want to listen to. Feel free to skip whatever parts you don't. So Slay the Spire is a roguelite and deck builder hybrid, and you fight through a series of levels, fight some enemies, and some other random encounters. And as you fight through these encounters, you collect more and more cards to build up a custom deck each time. You also collect these various short-term and long-term buffs via potions and relics. You clear 3 quote-unquote acts of the game, each of which end with a mini-boss, and it's just a really fun game in general. It was nominated for some Indie Game of the Year titles and awards, so if you're into roguelites and or card games, you should definitely look into it. As I mentioned before, Slay the Spire is a deck builder roguelite, and you fight through a series of levels of the Spire. In each level, you either fight an enemy, or there's some random or set event. So the enemies can be of normal or elite difficulty, or it can be a boss. And the events can be either a merchant you can buy more cards from, can be a fire you can heal at or upgrade your cards, or it can be a randomized event. You pretty quickly learn a lot of the enemy types. There aren't that many, but there is a pretty good variety with the number of random events that you can run into. So as you play through these levels and fight these enemies, run across these events, these merchants, you collect various cards and use them to sort of build and flesh out your deck. You can have a certain deck type in mind, but oftentimes as you play through the game, you might have to be a little flexible, as is often the case with roguelites. And cards have a different energy cost depending on their strength, and energy management is a very important game element, which is pretty typical of a lot of deck builders. You play through the game as one of 3 different heroes, each of who have distinct cards and game mechanics. And there are also some quote-unquote colorless cards that can be picked up across the different heroes, and they're usually more powerful, and you pick them up later in your runs. So the first hero is Ironclad, who you can run a deck where you sort of buff your damage with strength. You can do a lot of damage blocking. You can also exhaust cards from the game. You can just remove from the game, and you can sacrifice health for buffs. Next hero is Silent, who you can have a deck where you just play a bunch of cards. There's a lot of focus on discarding and drawing cards. There's also ship spam builds, so basically spam these one-time use attack cards. And there's the poison builds, which are just classic damage over time gameplay. And the last hero is the Defect, who's perhaps the most unique hero of the 3 to Slay the Spire as compared to other hard games. And with the Defect, you focus on different quote-unquote orbs of different types. And these orbs are things that you summon. They have different passive and active or quote-unquote evoked abilities. A lot of the cards unique to the Defect involve interacting with these orbs and making them stronger or doing various things with them. You can also collect potions as you play through the game, which you use for a one-time short-term buff. There are also relics as well, which offer a more long-term buff. Some of them are character specific and some of them are more general. You can also get different types of relics from different scenarios. These relics can have direct impact on the fighting itself, such as by giving you more energy per turn or having you heal before each boss battle. Or they can affect the other parts of the game, such as giving you more card choices or allowing you to heal more at rest spots. Additionally, occasionally some of the relics have drawbacks. So for example, this one relic lets you pick a bunch of cards and add them to your deck, but it also gives you some cursed cards, which are negative cards as well. Between the different cards that you get and the different relics you get in each run, playing through the game multiple times with the same character can lead you to have very different relics, very different cards that synergize in different ways. So it's not like each run is the same. So each run can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, depending on how fast you are and how far you go. And I would say the difficulty of the game ranges from about medium to hard, but it changes a lot with the different characters, different play style, and also what game mode you're playing. There are some more difficult game modes, but I'll talk about those later on in the progression section. The game mode itself definitely involves a lot of strategy. You have to know, which card should I use at some point, be able to adapt to the cards that come your way and different relics that you can choose from. And in fights, I would say there's a lot of risk-reward kind of trades-off. So, do I get in more damage now? Do I try to block this damage, take as little damage as possible? Is it worth just taking some damage now so I can get in some more damage on the enemy? There's only a limited amount of healing, so any damage you take in the earlier fights can, affect you in the boss fight as well. Overall, as I said earlier, I think it's one of the best, if not the best, roguelite of 2019. It's currently the most played roguelite of all time. It's really great for you to just drop in, do a couple runs, not play it for a couple months, and then come back. It's really easy to pick back up again. And there's also a lot of, as I'll talk about later, increasing the difficulty of gameplay. So once you clear it, there's ways of making the game harder and increasing that replayability. So now I'll talk about the RNG and randomness in Slay the Spire. So in some sense, it's not really RNG dependent. In another sense, the RNG is very baked in. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So it's not very RNG dependent in the sense that you rarely ever feel like you get truly screwed over by RNG. You have to obviously deal with whatever cards come your way, but that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of the strategy and stuff in the game is taking the cards that you have and trying to pick ones that synergize well. And it keeps the game fresh. So that's sort of like a good RNG there. Again, you don't feel like you get screwed over. It feels like it adds freshness. There are definitely some counterances. So one thing you can do sometimes is you can start off the game by choosing a random boss relic, and some boss relics are just not good for starting out the game. So there definitely are a few instances where you feel like you get screwed by RNG, but it's definitely not common. There's also RNG in the various events that you run into, and that mostly feels refreshing as opposed to hindering. Most events themselves aren't RNG based, with some exceptions, but rather which event you get is RNG based, and you can kind of choose what you want to do from there. That said, since it is a card game, the RNG is really baked in regards to which cards you find across your runs. So you pretty much always get a choice of several cards, so you're not like stuck with the cards. But if you really want to run a poison build and you're just not finding poison cards, it's obviously not going to work out for you. If you really need some more block cards and you're just not finding them, again, it's just not working out well for you. But that really doesn't happen very often. You kind of have to adapt to, maybe you can't run the exact type of deck that you want, but you can definitely run a deck that is viable with the cards that come your way. And also, because it's a card game, whichever cards you draw, that's a big source of RNG. So if you really need, just one attack card to finish the enemy this turn, you just don't draw an attack card. Or if you just need one block card to stay alive, you just don't draw any. You can kind of get screwed over there. But you can handle that as well by sort of managing your deck size, not taking more cards if you don't need them and stuff like that. But that's sort of the only place where I would say the RNG gets a little frustrating, is if you just, if you have certain cards you need, you only draw the cards that aren't helpful for a certain scenario. That's where it gets frustrating. So overall, I'd say it has a fair level of RNG, as is pretty inherent in any deck builder, but I don't feel like that it is hindered by the RNG. It never feels like the RNG is making you lose, but rather I think that RNG and that randomness puts freshness into the game, and that's sort of what you hope from randomness, what you hope from RNG in a roguelite. So now let's talk about mechanics that are unique to Slay the Spire and sort of set it apart from the other roguelites. So the most obvious one is that it's a card builder, deck builder roguelite. When Slay the Spire first came out, I didn't see any other deck builder, card builder roguelites out there. I've seen a couple now. For example, there's Griftlands, which is currently an alpha. But as a whole, that combination of deck builder, card game, and a roguelite is pretty unique, which is part of what made Slay the Spire so popular in the first place. So additionally, there's also daily runs in Slay the Spire, which are common in a lot of roguelites now, but definitely aren't present in all of them. There's the ability to seed runs, which is also common in a lot of roguelites now, but definitely not present in all of them. And for those that don't know, seeding runs means that you have a number, and you can use that number to have multiple people play through the same procedurally generated level or map. So in this case, you and your friend can each get the same number and play through the same run, where you will run across the same cards, same enemies, etc., etc. So it's a way of seeing who can maybe beat it faster or whatever through this exact same run without relying on RNG. Slay the Spire is also very, very mod friendly. It's very integrated into the game itself. When you first run the game, it asks you, do you want to run the game by itself or do you want to run the game with mods? So there's a lot of roguelites that are moddable, but Slay the Spire does a really good job of being incredibly mod friendly. So if you're into mods, that's something that can be a lot of fun as well. So now I'm going to talk about the sense of progression, replayability, and Slay the Spire. So first, I'll talk about horizontal progression. There's 3 different characters that you can play as, and each of these characters, as I mentioned in the gameplay section, have pretty different play styles, and they have unique cards and relics for each of them. So a lot of the replayability and progression come from playing with these different characters, unlocking different cards they have, discovering the different relics you can have with each of them. And as I mentioned earlier as well, there's also a 4th character in the works. There are also some achievements you can unlock. As I mentioned in the section before, there's daily runs, so each day there's a different run that you can do. There's also the ability to do custom daily runs, so basically there's different parameters that will randomly be assigned to each daily run. You can customize them however you want, so you can get a run that's unlimited with certain mechanics, whether it's like always get curse cards or like more elite enemies or whatever you want. There's a lot of options available for you to customize and change the game in that way. There's also a bunch of things to collect, so there's a page that can see all the cards and all the relics that you've run across, and so collecting those as well can be a sense of horizontal progression and add replayability there. It's also not really a sense of progression, but there's a lot of events that you can run across that are, again, those random events. Because there's so many, it takes you a while to run across all of them. So playing through again and again can be entertaining when you see some of the events that are they can be pretty funny and kind of quirky in various ways. And that's a sense of replayability as well from just seeing all the different events that are there. So that's the horizontal progression. Sort of progression or replayability that comes from the game that does not involve anything related to difficulty. Now I'll talk about vertical progression, which is progression that involves getting further or changing the difficulty of the game in some way. So as with all roguelites, with maybe a couple exceptions, the very first sense of vertical progression is, can you clear the game? Can you beat the game? I would say it's not particularly easy to roguelite. It's not the most difficult by far. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I would say it's a medium to hard difficulty. Definitely some of the heroes are much easier than others. So for example, it took me forever to clear the game with Ironclad. That's definitely the worst hero. Well, worst hero for me anyways, but I beat the game my first try with the defects, so your mileage will vary a lot depending on your playstyle and what hero you're playing with. After you can sort of beat the game, there's this mode called Ascension mode where you can make the game more difficult. There's 20 levels of Ascension, which just progressively make the game more and more difficult as you try to climb these levels. And so in that sense, there's a really good way of scaling difficulty, just whatever Ascension level you want, how far you can get. That's a really good sense of vertical progression that's present in Slay the Spire. There's also an endless modes, as I mentioned in the horizontal progression. You can customize whatever the criteria, whatever conditions you want for a certain run. And so you can make it in endless modes so that once you beat Act 3, you just restart at Act 1. You can just keep going and going and going until you fail or get bored or whatever. As a whole, because of all these things, the game has really, really good difficulty scaling. Once you can beat the game, you can make it slightly and slightly harder progressively until you kind of tap out or you beat the 20th level of Ascension. And so that's really fun if you want a roguelite that's basically the exact same game, but a little bit harder. I think that Slay the Spire does a really good job with that. And finally, this is going to be a mild spoiler, so if you want to not get any spoiler whatsoever, skip ahead to the narrative section, which I'll link in the description below. So there's a hidden boss that you can beat, which is really the quote-quote true boss, the true ending of the game. Once you've cleared the game at least once with each character, you unlock the ability to find and fight this fourth final boss. You'll have to do a couple special things on your run. Once you do that, you'll be taken to Act 4, which will have one enemy that you fight through, and then you'll run into this final boss, which is very, very difficult, I would say. And yet you can only really beat this boss with a couple types of builds. So unlike the rest of the game, I think is very friendly towards really any type of deck that you want, as long as it's obviously standardized as well. I think some of the higher levels, both the Ascension difficulty and with this final boss, you have to be more confined in your playstyles, only certain types of decks that work. It's a pretty difficult fight to really beat this final quote-quote true boss. I've gotten really close, but I haven't beaten it yet. That kind of gives you a guide of how difficult it is. So if you're into that sort of real difficult gameplay, Slay the Spire definitely has that as well for you. So now I'll talk a little about the narrative or story of Slay the Spire, which will be a pretty short discussion because there's not that much there. There's not really that much backstory about what the Spire is, why you're doing what you're doing, who these bosses are, etc., etc. But there is a little bit of lore, there is a little bit of world building in the game. As you run across certain random events, they'll kind of flesh out the world a little bit, give you some fun little stories and fun little tidbits about the game, and just be funny in general. But other than that, there's not that much there in the way of story, which, you know, isn't that weird with roguelites because most of them aren't story driven. But if you're looking for something that is story driven, this is probably not the roguelite for you, or at least you'll be playing it without the story in mind. So I'm going to give my overview, summary, and verdict on Slay the Spire. As a whole, I definitely strongly recommend this game. As I've said several times in this review, it's probably the best roguelite released 2019, and it's currently the most played roguelite of all time. So it's just a lot of fun in general. If you're a fan of roguelites and or card games at all, a deck builder kind of game at all, you should definitely check it out. There's a good amount of variety and different cards on each run. It's a pretty easy game to sort of pick up and play for a bit and then drop for a couple months and then pick up and play again. So it's really good in that regard, which is, you know, a really good quality to have for a roguelite. It doesn't get quite as cheap as some other roguelites out there, but it's definitely worth it even at full price. Doesn't really have any big downsides unless, you know, you really hate card games or you really want something with some story, then maybe you might be disappointed. But other than that, I strongly recommend it. There's a reason that it was nominated and won so many different awards for an indie game. So that's my review. So, you know, thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments about Slay the Spire, feel free to leave a comment and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in seeing more roguelite reviews. There's also a link in the description below to a playlist I have for all the roguelite reviews that I've done. So feel free to watch that if you're interested.